Imagine on a storm-ravaged night deep in the heart of rural America, a mysterious Mustang horse appears at the doorstep of an isolated cabin, carrying a satchel brimming with secrets powerful enough to rewrite history. Inside are letters soaked by rain letters, revealing lost land, hidden debts, and a veteran's untold heroism. Our protagonist, James Turner, a rugged former Army Ranger haunted by the memories of war and family regrets, suddenly finds himself thrust into an epic journey of redemption, resilience, and community unity. But who sent these messages, and how did this legendary Mustang survive alone in the wilderness for decades? Gentlemen, hold on to your hats and get ready for a remarkable adventure that's about to unfold right here on our channel. If you've ever served your country, cherished family traditions, or dreamed of a second chance, you'll want to see this story through to the very end. And please remember to subscribe, because we've got even more unforgettable stories of courage, honor, and frontier spirit coming your way. They say that certain memories hide in the corners of our minds, half forgotten, but never truly gone, waiting for the slightest prompt to resurface. For James Turner, a soft-spoken military veteran living near the remote edge of Ironwood Forest, that prompt arrived on a night when the skies unleashed a furious downpour and the wind battered against his cabin windows. He had grown used to solitude, having chosen a reclusive life to escape the haunting regrets that followed him home from deployments overseas. At 37 years old, James found solace in the wilderness he was sworn to protect. He worked as a ranger in the Ironwood Wildlife Preservation, a role he took partly for the isolation and partly for the chance to atone for the things he'd witnessed and done during his years in uniform. Even though he had grown accustomed to each echo of the forest, from the pattering of small creatures across pine needles to the distant calls of nocturnal birds, there was something about the storm that put him on edge. Thunder rumbled like distant artillery, and for a moment James found himself remembering nights in far-off deserts where the sky lit up with flares instead of lightning. Each flash beyond the window pane triggered memories of mortar fire. Yet he forced these recollections back down, reminding himself he was no longer in a combat zone, but in his modest cabin at the fringe of the forest. The place had once belonged to a retired ranger, but James had stripped it down to the bare bones. A single bed, a weathered table, a cast-iron stove, and a small bookshelf claimed the interior. Faded outlines on the wooden walls hinted where decorations and family photographs might once have hung, but James preferred emptiness. Every personal item he owned fit in a single trunk in the corner, locked away to keep any sentimental indulgences at bay. He didn't mind the Spartan setting. What truly nagged at him was a single-frame photograph perched on his mantle, a snapshot of James's father, Harold Turner, once a strong yet quietly affectionate man. That photograph was the only visual memory James had allowed himself to keep. Harold had passed away a little over a year before, and James still carried an intense guilt about not being there when it mattered most. While James had been out on a field training mission with the Ranger Service, Harold suffered a fatal stroke, leaving this world without a proper goodbye from his son. No matter how many logs James chopped, trails he maintained, or fires he extinguished in the preserve, he couldn't extinguish the regret burning inside him. On this particular stormy night, James tried to quell his restless thoughts by reading an outdated wilderness survival manual by lantern light. The rain pounded in sheets against the tin roof, sounding like an army of pebbles thrown by unseen hands. He considered turning in early, but a sudden lull in the storm's roaring crescendo caught his attention. In that brief calm, he heard a dull, rhythmic thumping on the porch. He paused, straining to listen, uncertain if his mind was conjuring the sound or if it was real. Then lightning slashed the sky, illuminating the clearing beyond his window. In the brief flash, he saw a dark silhouette, big, four-legged, unmoving. Initially, James wondered if it might be a deer, possibly seeking shelter under the eaves of his modest porch. Deer sometimes wandered close to the cabin, lured by the salt or scraps of food he occasionally left out. Yet something about the silhouette seemed larger, sturdier, more weather-beaten. The next flash of lightning revealed it was a horse, mud-splattered, soaked from the relentless rain, and standing unnervingly still in the middle of James's yard. The horse's posture was tense but composed, as if waiting for an invitation. Curiosity and concern propelled James to set his lantern down and step onto the porch. Rain soaked through his jacket the moment he cracked the door open. He squinted into the darkness, speaking softly so as not to spook the animal. "Easy there," he said. "Are you alone?" He caught himself. Of course, the horse couldn't answer with words. Yet what struck him was that there was no sign of any rider. Under the flicker of lightning, he could see the worn leather saddle strapped across the horse's back. Dripping wet, small rivulets of water cascaded off the saddle and onto the muddy ground. More astonishingly, there appeared to be a bulging satchel affixed behind the seat, also thoroughly soaked. James's first thought was that someone might have been thrown off. It wasn't unheard of for riders to get lost or separated from their horses, especially near Ironwood Forest, where the terrain could be unforgiving after heavy rain. He whistled softly, stepping down from the porch to get a closer look. The horse merely watched, flicking its ears, but making no attempt to flee. As James approached, he noticed a faint scar along the horse's left shoulder, a thin line about 5 inches. Something about that scar triggered a half-buried memory. Before he could dwell on it, James turned his attention to the satchel. Fastened with an old buckle, it looked like it had been on many journeys. He unlatched it cautiously, half expecting to find rations or typical trail gear. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Inside were letters, dozens of them, most of which were marred by mud and smeared ink, but still legible in places. Even a cursory glance told him these letters bore the name Harold Turner on the envelopes. Some had addresses from a place called Baylight Creek, along with return addresses he didn't recognize at all. He saw dates that spanned months and even years. Carefully, he pulled one free and tried to read the washed-out text. Words like hospital and land jumped out, as did references to urgency and unanswered pleas. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cold rain. Why on earth were letters addressed to his father tied to a strange horse that had wandered onto his property? Harold had never mentioned any ongoing correspondence, let alone something that sounded dire. Had these letters gone missing in the mail? Who was sending them and why so many? With trembling hands, James refastened the satchel and looked directly into the horse's dark, intelligent eyes. The animal seemed to stare back at him with a calm resignation, as if it understood the magnitude of what it carried. Knowing there was no room in his conscience to leave the horse out in the storm, James led it onto the porch, hoping the slight overhang would at least offer partial shelter. The animal followed him willingly, stepping around the rickety wooden boards with surprising delicacy. James slid the saddle off to relieve the horse of its burden, carefully removing the muddy satchel and placing it to the side. Each movement he made felt surreal, as if he were caught in someone else's dream. He grabbed an old blanket from the trunk inside his cabin and draped it gently over the horse, trying to rub away some of the mud and water. The horse shivered, its coat slick with rain, but it stood without complaint, occasionally shaking its mane to fling droplets away. There was a dignified patience to this creature, an unspoken understanding between man and horse that something far greater was happening than a simple shelter from a storm. Once the horse was as dry as James could manage, he unbuckled the satchel fully and brought the damp envelopes inside, where the lantern's glow was stronger. He spread them out on the rough wooden table, gingerly separating letters that had stuck together. They appeared to come from one person repeatedly sending messages to Harold Turner. The name on the return address was Beatrice Rowe. The writing style varied from neat cursive in older letters to a typed format in newer ones. A sense of urgency and desperation pervaded every snippet James could decipher. Talk of medical bills, references to property lines near Ironwood, and repeated requests for Harold to respond. His father had been gone for a year, taken by a stroke so suddenly that James never had the chance to say goodbye. The unanswered calls from the hospital, the guilt that gnawed at him for not being by his father's bedside, it all resurfaced with a piercing ache. Now he discovered that there had been a whole set of letters intended for Harold's eyes, none of which seemed to have reached him. James's stomach churned with the realization that his father might have died without ever reading these letters. Letters that could potentially have changed something crucial in those final months. Feeling a growing knot of questions, he looked out the window toward the horse. Its silhouette stood quietly, illuminated by a faint flash of distant lightning. James wondered, could this horse be one from his childhood? The faint scar on its shoulder looked too similar to the one on a Mustang named Spirit that Harold had nursed back to health years ago. James had been a teenager at the time, helping his father clean an ugly barbed wire wound. The horse eventually vanished after a stable accident, presumed dead. But now the possibility that it was the very same horse, older, hardened by years of survival, sent a jolt of both wonder and disbelief through James's chest. He didn't sleep a wink that night. Instead, he tended the horse as best he could, occasionally flipping through the letters despite their battered condition. Every new fragment of text heightened the mystery, mentions of a heroic act, land deeds, and a dire situation. By dawn, James felt an unshakable conviction that he needed to track down this Beatrice Rowe and find out what she knew. More importantly, he needed to understand why his father's name was all over these messages and why fate had chosen this particular impossible horse to deliver them. The storm died down by early morning, leaving the ground sodden and the sky an overcast gray. James busied himself pouring fresh coffee into an old tin cup. Though he could barely swallow past the tightness in his throat, the strong brew steadied his nerves. The horse whose old name Spirit kept echoing in James's head stood just outside, nibbling on tufts of wet grass. Its gaze would shift periodically toward James, as if patiently waiting for some unspoken command. In the lantern's first morning flicker, James re-examined the letters, sorting them by whatever date he could make out. The earliest one he found was dated about 2 years prior and spoke of urgent news regarding property near the Ironwood region. Another referenced a returning deed, and further reading suggested that Harold Turner might have been entitled to some land that had been unclaimed for decades. With each revelation, James felt his pulse quicken. Had his father known about this land? Had it been lost in legal tangles? None of this had ever come up in the father-son talks he remembered. Although Harold had often been tight-lipped about personal matters, especially after James joined the military. One of the final letters bore a date just a few months before Harold's death. It mentioned something about significant medical support offering to help pay for hospital bills. James closed his eyes, anger flaring at the tragic possibility that help had been waiting somewhere unclaimed, because none of these letters found their recipient. The frustration he felt toward the postal system, or fate, or whatever had conspired to hide these letters was almost too much to bear. But overshadowing that frustration was a gnawing guilt. Could James himself have done more if he had known his father's sudden passing had left so many things unsaid? James recalled how, in their final phone call, Harold had sounded a bit winded, mentioning he'd take care of something important. Soon James had assumed it was a minor health concern or some small errand. He never imagined it could involve unclaimed land or a secret lifeline from someone named Beatrice Rowe. Holding the letter up to the early light, James read Mr. Turner. If there is anything you need financial assistance or legal representation, please do not hesitate to contact me. Your kindness to my family should never be forgotten. The rest was blurred by water damage, but the sentiment was clear. He turned his attention to the horse again, stepping outside with the coffee steaming in his mug. A faint breeze rustled the pine trees, and the mud underfoot sucked at his boots with each step. Spirit, he murmured, feeling like he was speaking to a long-lost friend. The Mustang's ears perked forward. James approached slowly, extending a hand. The horse nuzzled it, breathing warmly against his palm. It was the same gesture James remembered from his teens. Gentle, trusting, the horse's breath carrying a scent of hay and earthy musk. If it truly was Spirit, how had it survived all these years? Where had it been, and why had it chosen to return now? Bearing letters that should have reached Harold long ago. A stray ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the tree line. As though the universe offered a hint of clarity, James felt a sudden resolve. He had to find out who Beatrice Rowe was, and he had to figure out if this talk of land near Ironwood had any bearing on his father's last days. There was only one place to start looking for answers. The small settlement of Creek Bend, the closest town with a post office that might have records or leads on the missing mail. He finished his coffee-padded Spirit's neck and silently vowed to unravel the mystery. Creek Bend wasn't so much a town as a loosely knit cluster of old buildings and weary storefronts. It had a single diner, a gas station that doubled as an auto shop, and a cramped general store that also housed the post office. One of James's duties as a ranger involved driving into Creek Bend every month for supplies, so he knew the roads fairly well. However, he rarely lingered to socialize. His lone wolf style earned him a nod of acknowledgement from residents, but not much more. That morning, James took a warm bridle and fashioned a temporary halter for Spirit. With a few gentle tugs, he coaxed the horse into following him down the muddy lane, leading to the main road. The sun had finally emerged, reflecting brightly off rain-drenched branches. The crisp scent of pine and damp earth pervaded the air, a sensory lullaby that momentarily eased the swirl of questions in his mind. About half an hour later, he reached the outskirts of Creek Bend. Townsfolk stared openly at the sight of a solitary man walking a weather-beaten Mustang. It wasn't unheard of to see horses in the area. Some locals kept them as work animals, but something about Spirit's haunted, dignified presence made people look twice. The older ones squinted, perhaps wondering if they recognized this horse from somewhere in the distant past. James first stopped at the post office inside the general store, a cramped space filled with the smell of musty paper and stale candy. A hunched elderly clerk eyed him suspiciously over the rim of her reading glasses. He introduced himself, explaining that he was trying to locate any mail that might have been addressed to Harold Turner, but never delivered. The clerk sorted through a dusty ledger but found nothing. According to her, there had been no significant backlog. When James mentioned the name Beatrice Rowe, the clerk shook her head, claiming she had never heard the name. Disappointed but not surprised, James thanked her and left outside. He could feel Spirit's impatience. The horse stomped a hoof near a puddle, as if urging him to do something else. He decided to try the diner. If local gossip lived anywhere, it was at Margie's Eatery, where a handful of patrons usually gathered to sip coffee and chat about anything, from the weather to local legends. Tying Spirit to a hitching rail by the diner's side, more to reassure the locals he wouldn't let the horse wander, James stepped in. The aroma of bacon and fresh biscuits greeted him. The bell above the door jingled, announcing his entrance. A few heads turned. Margie herself, a stout woman with a welcoming smile, gave him a friendly wave. James wasn't sure how to begin, but he ordered a coffee, then broached the subject quietly. "I'm looking for someone named Beatrice Rowe," he said, voice low. "She might have tried to send letters to my father, Harold Turner. Any chance you've heard of her or know if she's living nearby?" The question drew blank stares initially, but then one older gentleman at the corner table spoke up. He said he'd heard the surname Rowe in connection with some farmland further up north near a place called Baylight Creek, about a 2-day ride if you went slow or several hours by car if the roads weren't washed out. James thanked the man and finished his coffee, tipping Margie generously for her time. That lead might be all he had, but it was a start. Gripping Spirit's reins, he prepared to head out. If Baylight Creek was the key, then that was where he would go, no matter how many winding roads or muddy trails it took. Over the next day, James made preparations for a longer journey. He gathered enough supplies, dried goods, a canteen, a small first aid kit, and an extra tarp to ensure both he and Spirit would be safe on the road. Driving was an option, but James sensed that the horse was part of this riddle, and he felt compelled to keep Spirit close. Perhaps it was a sentimental decision, but a piece of him believed that the Mustang's presence would lead him closer to the truth behind his father's unreceived letters. He mapped out a route using an old topographical chart he dug up from the ranger station, plotting a path toward Baylight Creek. This small settlement sat on the other side of Ironwood Forest, nestled near a shallow river that fed into the region's broader watershed. Few travelers went that way unless they had business. Most truckers and tourists stuck to the main highways. Baylight Creek was known for quiet farmland, abandoned mines from decades past, and rumor had it, pockets of old land deeds that had never been fully resolved. The morning James departed, the skies were clear, offering a respite from the recent storms. He saddled Spirit carefully, taking extra time to check the horse's legs for any sign of strain or injury. Despite being older, the Mustang seemed more alive with each passing day, as though returning to old territory invigorated him. James double-checked the satchel that contained the battered letters. A few were too water-damaged to read thoroughly, but he kept them all, hoping that Beatrice Rowe might fill in the gaps. Leaving Creek Bend behind, he guided Spirit onto a dirt road that wound northward, flanked by dense stands of pine and oak. Fallen branches and puddles still marked the remnants of the recent storm. Occasionally, he had to dismount and clear debris, but Spirit navigated the terrain with patient steps. Whenever James felt a moment of doubt, wondering if he was chasing a ghost or a figment of his guilt, he'd glance at the horse's scarred shoulder. It reminded him that improbable stories could become real, that survivors return when you least expect them. By late afternoon, the canopy overhead grew thicker, casting long shadows across the path. James found a small clearing near a creek where he decided to make camp for the night. The routine of setting up a simple shelter came back to him as naturally as breathing. During his military tours, he had become adept at living off minimal gear, making do with what nature provided. He tied Spirit to a sturdy branch and let the horse graze on the fresh grass. The quiet burble of the creek and the chirping of crickets replaced the chaotic roar of the previous storm. Before turning in, James couldn't resist taking a closer look at the letters under the dim glow of his flashlight. Some contained phrases like heroic action decades ago and forever grateful, connecting Harold Turner to an event James had never heard about. Another letter mentioned, "If you can come to Baylight Creek, we will finalize the property records in your name," further solidifying that Harold's rightful claim to land was indeed the central issue. Drained by the day's travel, James let the letter slip from his fingers, drifting into a restless sleep, haunted by half-formed images of his father and the mysteries left unsolved. Morning brought a cool mist along the creek, the sky tinted pale pink with the rising sun. James made coffee over a small campfire, sipping slowly as he looked over at Spirit, who was already up and snorting at the damp air. It felt oddly comforting to have the horse as a companion, someone who understood silence without questioning it. James packed up his gear and set off again, determined to reach Baylight Creek by midday. The forest gradually thinned, replaced by rolling hills and pockets of farmland. Dilapidated fences lined patches of green where cows and sheep grazed. The few humans he encountered offered polite nods or guarded stares, as if uncertain about the stranger riding through. At one point, a pickup truck rattled by and the driver, a middle-aged man in a cap, slowed down to ask if James was looking for the main highway. James shook his head politely, saying he was bound for Baylight Creek on personal business. Around noon, the road descended into a shallow valley where a scattering of buildings came into view. A faded wooden sign with peeling paint read, "Welcome to Baylight Creek Population 312. James guided Spirit into what appeared to be the central area, a single-lane street flanked by a handful of aging structures, including a general store, a small post office, and a tiny library with boarded-up windows. The settlement seemed even quieter than Creek Bend, as though each building had a story locked behind closed doors. He stopped at the general store, tying Spirit to a post out front. The store's bell tinkled softly when he pushed open the door. Inside, the musty scent of old wood and sun-baked produce drifted through a lone cashier. A woman with kind eyes and braided hair looked up. James approached, his heart thudding. "I'm looking for someone named Beatrice Rowe," he said, noticing how her expression flickered from neutral to recognition. "Do you know where I might find her?" The woman bit her lip. "Beatrice lives a bit out of town up the Ridge Road." "Are you a friend or family?" James hesitated, not sure how to classify himself. "Not exactly. She wrote letters to my father, Harold Turner. I'm here to figure out why." With a nod, the cashier seemed to understand. "You'll want to head northwest. There's a gravel path leading up to a small cabin. It's got a rusted tin roof. Can't miss it." James thanked her and purchased a few snacks for the road. The cashier's parting words echoed in his mind. "She's been trying to contact someone for years. Maybe you can help her find peace." Stepping outside, James took a steadying breath. Every step in this journey felt heavier than the last, laden with the weight of his father's memory and the possibilities that might have changed Harold's life. Remounting Spirit, he followed the cashier's directions, the gravel crunching under the Mustang's hooves, both man and horse heading toward a long-awaited encounter. The ridge road was steep, twisting around old oak trees in patches of rocky ground. Loose stones threatened to slide under Spirit's hooves, but the horse kept a sure footing, occasionally flicking an ear at James, as though seeking reassurance. After 15 minutes of careful navigation, James spotted the cabin up ahead. A solitary structure with a tin roof spotted by rust, its wooden porch sagging slightly. Thin curls of smoke rose from a small metal chimney, indicating someone was home. He dismounted, tying Spirit to a nearby post that looked sturdy enough to hold. A narrow fence lined the perimeter, though parts of it had collapsed. Softly, James walked up the steps and knocked. The door creaked open to reveal a petite woman, likely in her 70s. her hair silver and pinned back in a loose bun. She steadied herself on a wooden cane, her lined face a study in caution and curiosity. "Yes," she asked, voice thin but firm. "I'm James Turner." He said, "I believe you knew my father, Harold Turner." The mention of Harold's name had an immediate effect. The woman's features flickered between shock and relief, as though she had waited for this moment far too long. "Harold's son," she whispered, then gestured for him to come inside. He followed her into a small living area where a pot of tea simmered on a stove. Stacks of books, letters, and old photographs cluttered every available surface. This, James realized, must be Beatrice Rowe. Once they were seated, James explained how he found the letters strapped to the horse, how none of them ever reached Harold before his death. At the mention of his father's passing, Beatrice lowered her gaze and clasped her hands in her lap. "I feared something like that," she said softly. "I wrote so many times begging him to respond. It pains me deeply to know he never saw what I sent." James felt his throat tighten. "You mentioned in these letters that my father saved you or your family a long time ago, and something about land near Ironwood." Beatrice nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. She explained that decades prior, Harold had intervened in a life-or-death situation. He had discovered Beatrice's young daughter, Evelyn, trapped after a car slid off an icy road. While others passed by, Harold scaled down the embankment, gave the girl his coat, and stayed until help arrived. "Evelyn might not have survived the cold without his kindness," Beatrice said, voice trembling with gratitude. "We owed him a debt we could never repay." Over time, they lost regular contact, but when Beatrice learned from a mutual acquaintance that Harold might be struggling financially and that he potentially owned a piece of unclaimed property near Ironwood, she tried every way she could to alert him, even offering financial support. "I had the resources to help him," Beatrice murmured, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just couldn't watch the man who saved my daughter's life suffer in silence." But then no reply. "For years I thought maybe he just didn't want my help. Now I know the letters never arrived." James thought of his father's final days. The mounting hospital bills, the silent worry etched in Harold's face the last time they spoke. If only these letters had reached him in time, things might have gone differently. The weight of what was lost pressed heavily on James's chest, and he fought back tears that threatened to blur his vision. Beatrice set out 2 chipped teacups and poured tea with a trembling hand. As they sipped, James asked more about the property she mentioned. Beatrice rummaged through a battered folder tied with twine, pulling out maps and photocopied records. She laid them on the table. James stared at the documents, trying to piece together the significance. Some dated back to the early 1900s, referencing a Gideon Turner, possibly James's great-grandfather, who had filed for a homestead, but never finalized the claim. "There was a fire at the county records office decades ago," Beatrice said. "Much of the documentation was lost, but enough survived in private holdings to show your father had the legal right to reclaim the land. It's a considerable parcel adjacent to the Ironwood Wildlife Preservation you work for." James's eyes widened, a surge of disbelief coursing through him. He had no idea his family once owned that stretch of forest. Beatrice went on to explain that in more recent years, the county had all but considered the land abandoned, and it would have reverted to public domain had no rightful owner emerged. The back taxes and bureaucratic red tape were considerable, but still it belonged to Harold, and by extension now belonged to James, if he could prove lineage and settle the outstanding obligations. "My daughter Evelyn and I were keen to see if Harold would take up the claim," Beatrice said. "We even had potential investors who were interested in a conservation project there. Some of them offered advance funds that could have eased Harold's financial burden." I wrote about all of this again and again, but no answer came. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging from the emotional toll. "I'm sorry, James. I wish it hadn't taken a horse turning up at your doorstep for you to learn all this." James nodded, struggling to process. A swirl of emotions battered him: anger at the lost chance that might have saved his father's life from spiraling medical debt, sadness that Harold died unaware of this avenue of relief, and a strange sense of duty to pick up where his father left off. "If it's still possible," he said quietly, "I want to see if I can claim that land, not to sell it off or anything, just to honor my father's memory or to do something good with it." Beatrice reached over and patted his hand. "That's precisely what Harold would have done. I'm sure he was a man of deep integrity. Let me help you find the right people to talk to. We'll need to contact the county land office, gather everything we have. It won't be easy, but it's worth the effort." The horse outside whinnied softly as if seconding Beatrice's sentiments. James found comfort in that sound. After all, it was the horse, this improbable messenger, that had set him on this collision course with the past. He looked at the discolored satchel that had carried the letters. Without Spirit's intervention, those words might have forever remained undelivered. Now they formed the keys to a legacy James never knew existed. The only question left was how to unlock the door. Before James left the cabin, Beatrice handed him an envelope containing the clearest copies of deeds, land surveys, and property records she'd managed to collect over the years. Although they were riddled with old stamps, partial signatures, and official seals that had faded or been damaged by the passage of time, they formed the core evidence that might hold up in a county review. "Take these to the land office in Redwood County." She advised a man named Calvin Hicks might still be in charge. He was the one who promised to expedite the process provided Harold himself showed up. Now that Harold's gone, you'll need to prove you're next of kin. James tucked the documents into his own bag, feeling both exhilarated and apprehensive. The notion of stepping into a bureaucratic labyrinth for land rights he only just learned about seemed daunting, yet the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. "Thank you," he told Beatrice, a swell of sincerity in his voice, "for keeping these records safe and for never giving up on my father. I wish he'd known." She blinked away tears and smiled. "Me too, dear. But perhaps you can still honor what he stood for. That land might become something that helps you or helps the community. Regardless, my door is always open, and if Evelyn can be of assistance, she will be. She has some legal knowledge, having worked in real estate. Unfortunately, she's been out of town on business. She'd have wanted to meet you with Spirit's reins in hand." James made his way back down the ridge road. Each step of the horse seemed to echo a promise he would unravel this legal quagmire, reclaim the property, and ensure that his father's name remained on it in rightful tribute. Part of him also itched to know how Spirit factored into the equation. The horse's reappearance after so many years almost felt orchestrated by the universe, or perhaps by Harold Turner himself, reaching beyond the grave. Could it really be that the Mustang carried not just letters, but also a final hope? By the time James reached Baylight Creek's small main street again, the sun had begun its slow descent, turning the sky into a canvas of dusky pink and gold. He stopped briefly at the local inn to secure a room for the night. Tomorrow he'd head for Redwood County's land office documents in tow, but for now he needed rest. His thoughts churned with possibility and regret, yet he also felt an undercurrent of resolve he hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as he lay on a thin mattress in the Spartan Inn room, he wondered if Harold was somehow watching. The old photograph of his father that he kept in his wallet now seemed heavier, imbued with new meaning. He whispered good night to the memory of the man he admired and prayed in his own quiet way that he was on the right path. Outside, Spirit was stabled for the night, likely dozing contently, having done his part to bring father and son closer, even across the gap of death. James woke early, the first glow of dawn seeping through the thin curtains of the Baylight Creek Inn. He splashed cold water on his face from the room's narrow sink, shaking off remnants of a restless sleep. His mind replayed details from yesterday's conversation with Beatrice Rowe, each revelation fueling a strange mixture of sorrow and anticipation. By now, the morning light had begun to illuminate a dusty corner of hope, the possibility that Harold Turner's legacy could be restored through the unclaimed land. The steps involved, however, would be substantial meeting with the county land office, organizing decades-old paperwork, and navigating the labyrinthine processes that modern bureaucracy demands. At the small stable behind the inn, James checked on Spirit, who appeared well-rested and unbothered by the unfamiliar surroundings. The horse greeted him with a snort as if urging him to press forward. James felt an odd reassurance in Spirit's presence, akin to an unspoken pledge of loyalty. Though James was still puzzled how this very same Mustang from his youth had found its way back, he sensed that Spirit's involvement was far from over. After a quick breakfast of scrambled eggs and lukewarm coffee at a nearby cafe, James mounted Spirit and set off toward Redwood County. According to the map and Beatrice's directions, it was roughly a 40-mile trek through rolling hills and farmland dotted with pockets of forest. Riding a horse that distance might raise eyebrows in the age of cars and highways, But James felt compelled to stay with Spirit, partly out of gratitude, partly out of a growing belief that the horse was integral to the unfolding story. The roads alternated between stretches of asphalt and gravel, but as he entered Redwood County, proper signs of more robust infrastructure emerged. Townships with slightly larger populations, more modern buildings, and the occasional chain grocery store indicated James was leaving the hinterlands for a region that saw heavier commerce. Occasionally, a passing motorist slowed to snap a photo of the lone rider and his rugged Mustang, the site an unexpected throwback to older times. James nodded politely, spurring Spirit onward. By midday, he arrived at a low-slung government complex with a sign reading, Redwood County Records and Land Office. Paved parking lots replaced the muddy roads of Creek Bend and Baylight Creek, and James took a moment to tie Spirit in a small grassy area near the building's side. Technically not a hitching post, but the best he could do. He patted Spirit's neck. "Wish me luck," he murmured, feeling an inexplicable pang in his chest as if he were walking into an arena. Inside, fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, and the air smelled faintly of floor polish. The reception desk was manned by a bored-looking clerk who barely glanced at James before asking need a form. James explained he was there to see Calvin Hicks regarding an inheritance claim of sorts. The clerk pointed him to a row of chairs. "Mr. Hicks is busy, have a seat." James lowered himself onto a plastic chair, clasping the folder of documents Beatrice had given him. He tried to calm the rising apprehension in his gut, aware that bureaucratic obstacles could be formidable. It was one thing to wave a century-old property map around in front of a kind old woman like Beatrice, but quite another to convince a county official to move mountains in your favor. 30 minutes later, James was ushered into a small office, the walls lined with filing cabinets. A desk overflowing with folders dominated the center, behind which sat Calvin Hicks, slender graying at the temples and wearing a pair of rectangular glasses. He looked up with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "James Turner, is it? Have a seat." James nodded, settling into the chair opposite. He immediately noticed the nameplate on the desk proclaiming, "Calvin Hicks, Deputy Land Registrar." James began by recounting a condensed version of the events leading him here, the letters that never reached Harold Turner, the mention of an ancestral claim to land near Ironwood, and the possible existence of old deeds. Calvin listened, occasionally making notes. When James handed over the folder, Calvin studied each page, carefully adjusting his glasses and tapping a pen against his desk. He let out a low hum when he reached the oldest documents referencing Gideon Turner from the early 1900s. "These are quite old," Calvin commented. "In many cases, incomplete homesteading or unfinalized claims get absorbed back into public domain. However, if the claim was never officially revoked and back taxes weren't systematically pursued, there might still be a legal pathway for you." James's spirits lifted slightly. At least Calvin wasn't dismissing him out of hand. But Calvin continued, "We'll have to do a thorough search of county archives to confirm the chain of ownership. That can take time, weeks, maybe months. And then there's the matter of outstanding taxes, potential penalties, or liens if the land was in a state of limbo." James felt a tightening in his chest. The mere thought of hefty back taxes or bureaucratic delays made him wonder if this was all too late. Would it ever truly come to fruition? Still, he voiced his determination. "I'd like to proceed whatever the steps. This was my father's right. I'd like to honor that." Calvin leaned back in his chair. "All right, Mr. Turner. Fill out these initial forms. We'll open a case file. You'll need to produce a death certificate for your father, your own birth certificate, and any probate documents that link you directly. Once we authenticate all that, we'll do a title search. If everything lines up, the county might recognize your claim." James thanked him, though inside he felt more than a bit overwhelmed. "One more thing," Calvin added, lacing his fingers. "Because of the potential size of this land, and from these documents it looks substantial, the county will want to ensure you have a plan for it. Letting it sit indefinitely could trigger more fees. Are you prepared to develop it, sell it, or maintain it in some official capacity?" James hesitated. He had thought only about claiming it to keep it safe, maybe preserve it as forest. "I'm a ranger," he said quietly. "I'm not interested in developing it. Maybe I could dedicate it to conservation or something similar." Calvin nodded. "That might help. If you can show an environmental or communal benefit, There could be grants or tax reductions. Leaving the land office. James felt a swirl of emotions. He was hopeful, yes, but also weighed down by the number of hurdles. It was suddenly clear stepping onto the path of reclaiming Harold Turner's legacy wouldn't be a simple matter. Spirit was waiting patiently outside, drawing curious looks from passers-by, who likely never expected a horse in the county building's parking lot. James untied the reins, patted the Mustang's neck, and led him toward a patch of shade. The next task would be tracking down all the vital documents Calvin Hicks had requested. James knew he had a copy of his father's death certificate at the ranger's cabin, along with a few personal files. As for his own birth certificate that might be accessible electronically, but Redwood County was well behind the times in that regard. Likely James would have to mail a request to the state or make an appearance at a records office in a larger city. Before he left Redwood County, James asked around town for any older residents who might remember hearing about the Turner land. Most people shrugged, but one older gentleman at a hardware store vaguely recalled a story of an abandoned homestead near Ironwood, rumored to belong to some old family. The clues were thin, but James gleaned that no one had attempted to log or develop the area in modern times, partly because the terrain was rugged and partly because the legal status was murky. That meant there was still hope the land remained untouched. Around mid-afternoon, James rode out of Redwood County this time, taking a more direct route to Baylight Creek so he could update Beatrice. The day's warmth radiated off the pavement in shimmering waves, and Spirit's hooves clicked rhythmically on the road. James ruminated on the story of how he ended up here. A battered satchel of letters, a reappearing Mustang that everyone believed was gone. The confluence of events was so uncanny it bordered on fate. He reached Beatrice's cabin by early evening. The old woman greeted him from her porch with an anxious smile. Over a light supper of vegetable stew, James recounted his meeting with Calvin Hicks. "He didn't shut me down," James reported. "But there's a lot of red tape. I'll need to gather documents of payback. Taxes could be large sums and show some plan for the land's future." Beatrice nodded gravely. "That's about what I expected. My daughter Evelyn might be able to help with some of the legalities once she returns. She has some experience with property law, especially around here." James looked at the folder of old maps, land deeds, and letters that had guided him thus far. The corners were worn pages, almost translucent from repeated handling. "I'm not giving up," he said, meeting Beatrice's gaze. "My father might have missed this chance, but if there's a way to claim it posthumously in his honor, I'll do it." Beatrice's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She reached out and clasped James's hands. "He saved my daughter's life. Once I want to help save his legacy. Whatever I can do, I will." The sincerity in her voice confirmed that James was no longer alone in this mission. After finishing his meal, James stepped outside into the twilight. A soft glow blanketed the rolling hills, and the silhouette of Ironwood Forest was visible in the distance. The hush of night reminded him of times he'd spent on guard duty overseas, scanning the horizon for threats. Tonight, though, it felt like he was scanning for hope. Leaning against the cabin's porch rail, James promised himself he'd see this through, even if it meant battling months of legalities and uncertain outcomes. Within a couple of days, James was back at his small ranger's cabin at the edge of Ironwood Forest, having retraced his route with Spirit. He didn't return empty-handed. The folder was thicker now, with forms and instructions from Redwood County, plus a list of tasks that needed urgent attention. James set about gathering everything from personal documents to old photos that might help prove his lineage. He found Harold's death certificate in a dusty cabinet, along with property tax statements that ironically had only been for the modest farmland Harold once owned on the outskirts of Creek Bend. Nothing in those statements mentioned the larger land near Ironwood, but at least it was documentation that might tie father to son in an official capacity. By day, James fulfilled his ranger duties, checking trails, filing wildlife reports, and ensuring campers adhered to safety guidelines. By night, he pored over genealogical websites, attempting to piece together the Turner family tree. A few phone calls to older relatives shed some light. Apparently, Gideon Turner had once staked a claim on forested acreage, only to have it slip through bureaucratic cracks when he died. Harold must have inherited that knowledge but never acted on it or tried and failed. A pang of sadness cut through James each time he considered how his father's final months might have been different had he known help was forthcoming. To complicate matters, Redwood County required James to appear in person again, this time with official copies of all these documents. He decided to drive instead of ride Spirit, as the collection of papers was getting unwieldy. However, he refused to leave the horse unaccounted for. He arranged a temporary corral near the ranger station, ensuring Spirit had shelter water and a secure area to roam. He left the satchel, now cleaned of mud, but still showing signs of wear, looped over the corral fence, as if symbolic of everything that had happened. Before setting off in his old pickup truck, James couldn't resist one final check on Spirit. The horse paced slowly along the fence line, occasionally glancing at James with an inscrutable expression. "I'll be back soon," James said, feeling slightly foolish for speaking to an animal, as though it would respond. But in his gut, he believed Spirit understood more than anyone realized. After all, it was the horse's uncanny reappearance that set this entire journey in motion. The drive to Redwood County felt oddly quicker than the ride on horseback. Tarmac unspooled before him, and the scenic view of pines and rolling hills blurred past. James tried to focus on the potential conversation with Calvin Hicks, rehearsing how he'd present the documents, how he'd handle questions about finances and future land use. Doubts lingered. Could he afford any back taxes on that kind of property? Would the county even allow him to keep it if he had no immediate plan other than preservation? Yet each question circled back to a singular, unwavering determination. This was about more than just land. It was about honoring Harold Turner, a man who had quietly saved lives, including Beatrice Rowe's daughter, without seeking recognition. That silent heroism deserved a final chapter worthy of the name Turner, a chapter James intended to write with the land as its setting. When James walked into Calvin Hicks's office the second time, the receptionist almost recognized him, offering a curt nod instead of the indifferent shrug from before. Calvin was in a phone meeting, so James loitered in the waiting area, the stack of documents in a neat folder pressed to his side. A few minutes later, Calvin emerged and beckoned James to follow him to a conference room lined with shelves of thick binders labeled by property zones and parcel numbers. "All right," Calvin said, settling into a chair at the head of a small wooden table. "Let's see what you've got." James handed over the folder. Calvin flipped methodically through the death certificate, old mortgage statements, linking Harold's name and address and genealogical records that traced James directly to Gideon Turner. Occasionally, Calvin paused to jot notes or compare something with an electronic database on his laptop. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights seemed amplified in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, Calvin closed the folder, steepled his fingers, and faced James. "Your documentation appears to be in order. The genealogical link is consistent, and we have no record of anyone else claiming the Turner homestead." "That's a strong starting point." James exhaled a tension leaving his shoulders, but Calvin continued. "We do have to address the outstanding property taxes, at least for the years following Harold's 18th birthday, since that's when the claim would have transferred to him if the homestead had been finalized." James's eyes widened. He had expected some taxes, but the notion of paying for decades made him anxious. "How much are we talking about?" Calvin rattled off a rough figure that made James's stomach sink. It was enough to buy a modest house in most parts of the state. "Now you could petition for a reduction," Calvin said, noticing James's reaction, "if you can argue that the land was never fully recognized. Or you might get exemptions if you convert the land into something beneficial, like a conservation zone or a public trail extension. Otherwise, it's a lump sum." Nodding, James tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm a ranger. I'd prefer to keep the land as wild as possible. Maybe set up educational programs or guided tours that highlight natural habitats." Calvin leaned back. "That could work in your favor. If you're open to drafting a formal proposal, the county board might waive a portion of the taxes." They spent another hour discussing next steps. Calvin would initiate a formal record search to ensure no other heirs existed. James would draft a plan for the land's use. Meanwhile, partial payments for the taxes could start to show good faith. The entire conversation was starkly practical, absent the sense of wonder James felt about the property. But he left the county office with the skeleton of a roadmap. He'd have to figure out how to pay, or at least negotiate the sum. Perhaps fundraisers, loans, or grants could bridge the gap. Driving away, James stared at the passing fields with a racing mind. How many times must Harold have been on the cusp of discovering this path only to be foiled by lost letters and life's relentless demands, James vowed not to let the same fate befall him. In the following weeks, James found himself juggling multiple roles: ranger, amateur genealogist, budding property manager, and occasional fundraiser. He approached local conservation groups hoping they might be willing to partner. A few expressed interest, especially once they learned the size of the forested area and its potential biodiversity. One group tentatively offered to help with grants if James formally dedicated the land as a wildlife sanctuary. On a more personal level, James also reached out to old family acquaintances he hadn't spoken to in years. Some lived out of state and had no idea Harold had passed away. A few were shocked to learn of the hidden homestead. No one, however, claimed any right to the property or contested James's pursuit. Gradually, it seemed every phone call and piece of paperwork inched him closer to legally securing the Turner land. At times, the complexity made James want to throw up his hands in defeat. Yet each night he'd stroll outside to see Spirit dozing near the corral, the horse's calm reminding him that improbable journeys often began in improbable ways. Then unexpectedly, James received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. When he picked up, a woman introduced herself as Evelyn Rowe, Beatrice's daughter. She explained she'd returned to Baylight Creek and learned of everything from her mother. "I hear you've been working tirelessly to secure your father's claim." Evelyn said, her voice carried a note of earnestness. "I have some knowledge of real estate law, and I'd be glad to assist. My mother feels she owes you and your father a debt that can never be fully repaid." James felt a wave of relief. Evelyn's professional background could be invaluable, especially when drafting proposals or negotiating back taxes. They arranged to meet in Creek Bend the following week so Evelyn could see the area firsthand and help finalize some paperwork. Before hanging up, Evelyn added, "I'm also bringing Mom. Her health isn't the best, but she insisted on seeing how far you've come." James hesitated, worried about Beatrice's condition, but he also understood her determination. "All right," he agreed, "but we'll take it slow and easy for her." He ended the call feeling more hopeful than he had since discovering the letters. The puzzle pieces were aligning. There was still the matter of raising the actual funds, but every conversation he had with county officials suggested they were open to compromise if the land served a public good. James started jotting down ideas: nature trails, a possible visitor center, an outreach program for local schools to learn about forest ecosystems. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like a calling, extending his ranger work onto his own family's land. That night, as James walked toward the corral under a sky splattered with stars, Spirit lifted his head and let out a low nicker. James approached, running a hand along the horse's strong neck. "We're doing it, buddy," he murmured, voice low. "We're making sure Dad's memory lives on." In the horse's deep gaze, he thought he saw the reflection of starlight, or maybe the glimmer of something more profound, approval or a gentle push from the universe, that yes, he was on the right path. Evelyn and Beatrice arrived in Creek Bend on a brisk afternoon, the sky overcast, yet free of rain. James met them outside the small diner where they decided to have a warm lunch before heading to see the property. Beatrice, leaning on her cane, looked frailer than before, her cheeks drawn, her eyes shadowed with fatigue, but her smile brightened upon seeing James. "You look more determined each time I see you," she said, voice quivering with affection. Evelyn, a poised woman in her 40s, bore a striking resemblance to her mother around the eyes. She wore a tailored jacket and carried a satchel of files, a contrast to James's rugged ranger attire. Once they settled in a booth, Evelyn spread out documents on the table. She explained potential strategies for requesting partial abatements on the taxes, such as citing lack of notice due to the county's flawed record-keeping. She also mentioned philanthropic organizations that might help fund a conservation easement. The flurry of legal terms and references to obscure statutes made James's head spin, but he trusted her expertise. After lunch, they drove out toward Ironwood Forest, where James's ranger cabin sat. The closer they got, the more awed Evelyn seemed. "I'd heard it was beautiful, but I never imagined the forest would be this majestic," she said, rolling down the car window to peer at the tall pines and moss-laden ground. Beatrice merely gazed out, her silence punctuated by moments of deep reflection. They reached James's cabin, and he introduced them to Spirit, who stood near the corral gate with ears twitching. "So that's the horse that brought the letters." Evelyn murmured, a note of amazement in her voice. Beatrice approached Spirit, carefully offering a gentle pat on his muzzle. Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes as she whispered, "Thank you for not giving up, old friend." Although James didn't know if she'd ever met this horse in the past, it felt as though she was speaking to a faithful messenger of fate. Soon after they decided to trek deeper into the woods, following a narrow path that led to the boundaries of the land James aimed to claim. Though the terrain was uneven and Beatrice needed frequent breaks, she insisted on continuing, determined to see the place she had read about for years. Evelyn took pictures of notable landmarks, a stream trickling over rocks, clusters of towering pines and a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the ridges. "There's so much potential here for environmental education," she said, excitement creeping into her normally measured tone. "Guided tours, bird-watching stations, maybe even a small visitor's lodge if done sustainably." Beatrice sat on a fallen log, breathing heavily but smiling. "This forest has an energy," she said softly, voice trembling. "Your father felt it, I'm sure. That's why he never entirely let go of the idea this land might be ours." James knelt beside her. "I wish he'd told me," he murmured. "All this time I had no clue." Beatrice laid a hand on his shoulder. He was a proud man, also humble. Perhaps he didn't want to speak of it until he was certain, or maybe life kept getting in the way. They all lingered for a while, savoring the hush of wind through the pines. Evelyn took more notes referencing possible next steps. James felt a pang of contentment tinged with sadness. He was closer than ever to fulfilling a piece of Harold's legacy, but it came too late for father and son to celebrate together. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn proved invaluable drafting letters to county officials and organizing the evidence to present at an upcoming hearing, a formality required to confirm James's rightful claim and work out the tax situation. She helped gather testimonies from people who could speak to Harold's character, including residents from Creek Bend who remembered him as a quiet but generous soul. Even some who only recalled him vaguely were willing to sign statements supporting James's petition. Meanwhile, Beatrice, despite her frail health, urged James not to lose momentum. She insisted that seeing the cabin rebuilt or a new structure erected on the land would be her greatest joy. James divided his time between his ranger responsibilities, the ongoing legal negotiations, and physical work on the site itself. With the county's tacit permission, though not an official go-ahead yet, he began clearing undergrowth in a small patch of the land, planning a campsite that might become the foundation for a future visitors area. A few neighbors from Creek Bend joined in on weekends, intrigued by the story of lost letters in a hidden homestead. Some brought sandwiches or lent tools. Others simply offered moral support. James found himself humbled by their willingness to help. He had spent so much time after Harold's death pushing people away, resigned to solitude. Now it felt like an entire community was rallying behind him. Whenever James felt doubts gnawing at him about finances, the looming land hearing, or the weight of responsibility, he'd take a break and walk among the towering trees. Often Spirit would trail behind, hooves crunching softly on the forest floor. The horse's presence reminded him of the improbable nature of this journey. If the horse had made it back after years in the wild, perhaps hope could outlast any number of obstacles. Just as plans were stabilizing, an unexpected storm battered the region. Heavy rains pummeled the newly cleared sections, turning them into muddy quagmires. The wind uprooted small trees and scattered branches across the trails. James and a few volunteers spent hours chainsawing fallen limbs and hammering makeshift repairs. The storm also did a number on the roads, creating detours that threatened to delay the crucial county hearing date. Evelyn sent James a worried text. "We need to submit final documents in person by Tuesday, or the hearing gets pushed back." Pushed back could mean months given the backlog of property cases. James dreaded the idea of losing all the momentum they'd built. So he resolved to drive a makeshift route around the washed-out main road, even if it meant an extra hour or two of detours. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind fog-shrouded valleys and sparkling droplets on every leaf. James loaded the final documents into his truck, kissed the photograph of Harold that he'd taped to the dashboard, and set off. He tried to quell the butterflies in his stomach by reminding himself that he had done everything he could. The rest was in the county's hands. In a bittersweet way, it felt like the day of a big exam. Only the grade would define the future of his father's land and legacy. The Redwood County Courthouse stood on a slight rise, its pale brick facade gleaming in the post-storm sunshine. James arrived with minutes to spare parking near a row of vehicles belonging to lawyers and staff. Clutching the binder of documents, he strode inside, greeted by the echo of footsteps on polished floors. A receptionist directed him to a small courtroom where land dispute hearings took place. Evelyn was already there, seated at a table with a neat stack of papers. She gave James a reassuring nod as he joined her. Across the aisle sat two county representatives presumably assigned to evaluate the case. Calvin Hicks was among them, wearing a neutral expression that James couldn't decipher. When a clerk called for order, the small group rose, then sat as a robed official. County Commissioner Dolores Brand entered and took her seat behind a wooden dais. The hearing began. Evelyn presented the case summarizing the Turner family history and the lost deed that had never been finalized due to the early 20th century record-keeping fiasco. She highlighted Harold Turner's lineage, James's position as his only surviving child, and the extensive evidence of genealogical ties. James, for his part, spoke earnestly about his intention to conserve the land, describing possible initiatives for wildlife preservation and community education. He also invoked the emotional dimension letters that arrived too late, a father who never had the chance to benefit from his rightful claim. The county representatives asked questions ranging from the exact acreage to the potential risk of liability if the land were open to public access. Calvin Hicks presented the estimated back taxes and penalties adjusted by the inflation, and the arguments Evelyn had put forth. James's stomach twisted into knots hearing the amount read aloud, but Evelyn calmly countered with references to legal precedents where such debts had been reduced due to extenuating circumstances. Commissioner Brand leaned forward, lacing her fingers. "Mr. Turner, it seems you have a strong historical claim here. The question remains, what will you do if we grant you official ownership, but can't waive enough of the fees to make it feasible?" James drew a breath, glancing at Evelyn. He answered quietly, "I'll do everything in my power, fundraisers, partnerships with conservation groups, personal loans if I have to. This land was meant for my family, and I believe it can serve a greater good." After nearly an hour of back and forth, the commissioner recessed the hearing for a brief deliberation. James and Evelyn waited in tense silence. He couldn't help but picture Harold's face in that old photograph, imagining his father's reaction to all this. When the commissioner and county reps returned, the atmosphere felt electric. Dolores Brand cleared her throat. "Mr. Turner, the county recognizes the legitimacy of your family's historical claim. We are prepared to grant provisional ownership contingent on a payment plan for back taxes with partial forgiveness if you follow through on making the land accessible for conservation and limited public use. Full details will be in writing, but effectively you can assume stewardship of the Turner property as soon as the final paperwork is signed." Relief flooded James so powerfully that he had to blink back tears. He nodded, words escaping him. Evelyn squeezed his arm in a congratulatory gesture, her composure cracking into a broad smile. The official hammered her gavel softly to close the hearing. Just like that, decades of lost opportunity and Harold Turner's unvoiced dream found a new champion in his son. Outside the courthouse, the sun had broken through the clouds, revealing a bright blue sky. James and Evelyn stood on the steps, the weight of the moment settling in. He held the provisional documents, scanning them with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Yes, there would be costs to manage, but it was real. He was recognized as the rightful heir to the Turner homestead near Ironwood. He could almost feel his father's spirit in the breeze that ruffled the pages. Evelyn gave him a warm hug. "Congratulations, James. You did it." The words felt surreal. A year ago, James had been holed up in a lonely cabin, drowning in regret. Now he stood on courthouse steps, forging a path that honored Harold's memory and gave it new life. "It's not just me." James' managed voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without your help and your mother's persistence, or without Spirit. That horse practically forced the letters into my hands." Evelyn laughed softly. "That horse is a miracle in itself." Glancing at her phone, she frowned. "Let's go tell Mom the good news." She stayed at the motel because the hearing would have been too much for her. "I know she'll be thrilled." James nodded, remembering Beatrice's fragility. He hoped this announcement would give her a dose of joy and strength. They navigated the busy street back to James's truck, each step feeling like the beginning of a brighter chapter. Later that afternoon, they found Beatrice resting on a chair outside her motel room, breathing in the fresh air. When Evelyn and James relayed the outcome, tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. She clutched James's hand in both of hers. Harold would be so proud, she whispered. He saved me once. And now, in a way, you've saved his dream. James swallowed hard, overcome by gratitude. He knelt beside her, feeling the thread of destiny that tied their families together. As they parted ways, James promised to keep them updated about the next steps, setting up a payment plan, drafting conservation proposals, and physically restoring the land. Beatrice insisted she would visit the site again. Soon, health permitting, Evelyn reaffirmed her commitment to guide James through the legal aftermath. You've won a huge victory, she cautioned, but the real work is just beginning. Driving back to Creekbend, James replayed the day's events in his mind. He remembered the gavel falling, the hush of the courtroom, and the sense that Harold's legacy had finally been acknowledged. When he arrived at his ranger's cabin, twilight was just settling in. Spirit noticed his truck's headlights let out a welcoming neigh from behind the corral fence. James stepped out, the official documents tucked securely under his arm. He approached the corral, unlatching the gate so he could stand beside the horse. It's ours, Spirit, he said, letting the words hang in the cool air. The Mustang nudged James's shoulder with a gentle push. In the fading light, James imagined Harold's voice whispering approval, urging him to go forward without fear. Tomorrow he'd begin real planning, construction, funding outreach tonight, though he allowed himself a moment of peace. Leaning his head against Spirit's flank, he let the hush of the forest and the scent of pine remind him that sometimes the most improbable journeys lead exactly where they need to. Securing the provisional title to the Turner homestead marked only the first step in a process that demanded as much sweat and tenacity as any mission James had ever undertaken. Within days of the court hearing, James began drafting a formal plan to transform a portion of the newly recognized property into a nature preserve with limited public access. He reached out to the Ironwood Wildlife Preservation, the same organization that employed him as a ranger, hoping to form a collaborative agreement. Much to his relief, they expressed keen interest. The preservation's board members saw potential for expanded trails and a small education center that could serve visitors and school groups alike. At home, James set up a war room of sorts in his small cabin. Paperwork took up nearly every surface county, forms, budget spreadsheets, architectural sketches of possible trail layouts. He even started a digital fundraising campaign explaining the property's backstory, how it was nearly lost to time, how it carried the memory of Harold Turner, and how the Mustang name Spirit had delivered the crucial letters. To his surprise, the online response was immediate and heartfelt. People from as far away as neighboring states chipped in small donations, moved by the story of a hidden inheritance redeemed through steadfast determination. Evelyn provided ongoing legal support, fine-tuning the language in James's proposals so they met county standards. She was especially diligent about ensuring that the partial tax forgiveness and conservation agreement were locked in airtight provisions. Once or twice a week, she visited to discuss progress, sometimes bringing Beatrice along. The older woman's health remained fragile, but James noticed a sparkle in her eyes whenever she observed new developments, like the freshly marked trailhead or the wooden sign James erected that read, "Turner Legacy Preserve." It was a simple gesture, but it embodied the very reason James had fought so hard to give Harold's memory a place to flourish under the open sky. Meanwhile, a crew of volunteers, some from Creekbend, others who had read James's online updates, began congregating at the property on weekends. They laid out paths, cleared debris, and erected markers identifying flora and fauna. James found himself directing tasks, grateful for every set of hands. More than once he overheard a volunteer exclaim how astonishing it was that a horse had served as the messenger for all of this. Spirit often roamed near the work crews, unperturbed by the noise of saws or the chatter of groups. The Mustang had become something of a local legend, a living symbol of second chances. In the midst of these hectic efforts, James continued his ranger duties for Ironwood Forest, early morning hikes to inspect trails, midday sessions, training new recruits late afternoons, responding to scattered calls about lost campers. It was exhausting, but in a way, it invigorated him. No longer did he spend nights haunted by regret, staring at the single photograph of Harold. Now that photograph hung in a small wooden frame on the trunk of a towering pine at the property's entrance beneath a plaque that read, "In honor of Harold Turner, who believed in the quiet power of doing good." As construction on the cabin and small visitor station moved forward, James discovered that a sense of community began to envelop the land in the same way the forest canopy did. People showed up after their day jobs willing to hammer nails or lay down gravel paths for free. Some evenings, local families arrived with children curious to see deer tracks in the mud or to catch a glimpse of Spirit meandering among the trees. After a while, it wasn't unusual for James to see children squeal with delight as Spirit let them stroke his mane under close supervision. The horse, once a lone wanderer, seemed to have found a place where it was equally revered and protected. The modest visitor station, a sturdy wooden structure with a broad porch, slowly took shape near the clearing that formed the natural gateway to the Turner Legacy Preserve. James enlisted the help of two retired carpenters from Creek Bend who guided volunteers in framing walls and installing a metal roof. Every new beam that went up felt like a promise fulfilled. James noticed the land itself seemed to liven with each improvement. Birds nested near newly placed feeders, and small critters scurried across the open pathways. It was as though the forest recognized it was finally being acknowledged and respected in the way Gideon Turner might have once intended. But not every day was smooth. Bureaucratic hurdles continued to pop up: fire safety inspections, liability insurance, updated surveys, and the ongoing requirement to pay back taxes in installments. More than once, James found himself poring over the budget in frustration, worrying that delays might jeopardize the entire project. That's when he'd look out to see Spirit or recall a heartfelt note someone wrote on the fundraising website, praising Harold's legacy and urging James not to surrender. Hope, it seemed, was as renewable a resource as the forest itself. Evelyn proved especially crucial on the financial front. She managed to secure a small philanthropic grant earmarked for community-driven conservation projects. Combined with the local donations and James's personal savings, it was enough to keep the tax payments on schedule. "You're doing something remarkable," Evelyn told James one day as they reviewed receipts under the newly built visitor station's roof. "A year ago, my mother thought she would never see the day Harold Turner's name would be honored for all he did." James nodded. "Your mother's belief in my father was the spark. This place, the volunteer spirit, it's grown into something bigger than I ever imagined." He recalled how Harriet, the diner owner in Creek Bend, had begun telling travelers about the preserve. A few had even detoured from their routes to stop by. He'd greet them, show them the emerging trails, and explain how the entire land was nearly lost, if not for a single Mustang delivering lost mail. The notion might have sounded fantastical if it wasn't standing right there before them. Sometimes in the evenings, James took personal rides deeper into the property with Spirit, forging a bond with the horse that transcended simple caretaker and animal dynamics. It felt like a partnership of equals, two beings that had both found a sense of purpose in reclaiming this land. Once, while pausing atop a small ridge, James pictured Harold standing beside him, contently surveying the rolling forest. It didn't feel like a daydream. It felt real, like father and son had finally reunited in spirit under the green canopy of pines. As the preserve neared a stage fit for a soft opening, James and the volunteers planned a small celebration to honor the community's efforts. They named it a Forest Renewal Day, inviting everyone who had lent a hand or even voiced support to gather at the new visitor station. Rumors spread that a local folk band might come and perform, adding a festive air to the occasion. The date was set for early autumn, when the leaves of the smaller hardwoods, interspersed among the pines, took on hues of gold and crimson, promising a vibrant backdrop. The days leading up to the event were a flurry of final touches, clearing any stray debris, marking additional signs, and assembling simple displays inside the station that explained the land's history. Evelyn meticulously wrote up plaques describing the Turner family legacy, while James added photos and letters, those that remained legible, from Beatrice's trove. One glass case showcased the original satchel that had carried all the letters, displayed alongside a short written account of how Spirit showed up on James's porch. That fateful stormy night, Beatrice's health had fluctuated, but she insisted on attending. She confided in James that seeing the preserve completed was a cornerstone of her final wishes. He arranged for a comfortable chair and canopy near the station so she could rest in the shade. Spirit, of course, would be free to roam. James even placed a shallow water trough nearby, suspecting the horse might want to stay close to the crowd. Though Spirit had proven to be unflappable in bustling environments, James wasn't about to tie him too far away on such a momentous day. When Forest Renewal Day arrived, the skies were crisp and clear, the early sun washing the forest in a golden glow. One by one, cars, pickup trucks, and even a few horse trailers arrived parking along a newly flattened patch of ground. Families stepped out carrying picnic baskets. Local artisans set up small tables displaying hand-carved wooden crafts, preserves, and crocheted items, giving the event a homemade charm. The folk band tuned their guitars under the visitor station's porch, the air filled with a festive hum. James, wearing a simple ranger uniform with an added name tag that read, Turner Legacy Preserve, welcomed each attendee with a handshake or hug. Many folks approached him just to say how inspired they were by the tale of lost mail leading to found opportunity. Children darted around squealing whenever they spotted a squirrel or a chipmunk. Some of the braver ones tried to feed Spirit an apple slice. The Mustang obliged, snorting contentedly as though proud to be the center of attention. Evelyn arrived with Beatrice, who looked frail but notably happy. James guided them to their spot, handing Beatrice a small cushion for extra comfort. She gazed around with moist eyes, taking in the laughter, the music, and the sight of neighbors bonding over the land's newfound purpose. "Thank you," she said to James, her voice barely audible over the nearby chatter. "For everything you've done, for everything Harold couldn't do. It's more beautiful than I ever dreamed." A short ceremony kicked off around midday. The folk band played a gentle tune as James took to the makeshift stage, a platform of pine boards erected in front of the visitor station. He cleared his throat, scanning the crowd of roughly 70 people. Though not massive by any big city standard, it was a significant gathering for Creek Bend and Baylight Creek folks. He spotted Agnes from the diner, the older gentleman who had given him directions to Baylight Creek months ago. Even the Redwood County Registrar, Calvin Hicks, standing off to one side with a curious grin. "Thank you all for coming," James began, his voice echoing just enough to hush the chatter. "Today is about celebrating a forest that was almost forgotten and a legacy that was nearly lost. My father, Harold Turner, never got to see what you see now, but his belief and compassion in rescuing those in need, like he did for Beatrice Rose's daughter, lives on here." James paused, emotion thickening his voice. The crowd seemed to lean in, some dabbing their eyes. He continued, describing how the property claim was dormant for decades, how the letters never reached Harold, and how Spirit miraculously showed up one stormy night with that old satchel. "When I first read those letters," James said, eyes flicking to Evelyn and Beatrice, "it felt like my father's voice was calling me from beyond, telling me to do something bigger than myself. Now, looking at all of you and this preserve, I think I finally understand what he intended." Applause spread through the gathering as he concluded with gratitude for everyone who helped Beatrice, Evelyn, Calvin, the volunteer carpenters, the donors, and every single person who lifted a hammer or cleared brush. James gestured toward the plaque that had been installed on the visitor station wall. "We're dedicating this place not just to Harold Turner, but to the spirit of community that brought it to life." The crowd roared in approval, and the band launched into a cheerful number that made some children dance in the grass. Volunteers wheeled out tables laden with potluck dishes, cornbread pies, casseroles, and home-brewed cider. The aroma mingled with the evergreen scent of the forest, forging an atmosphere that was at once celebratory and intimate. People mingled, shook hands, and shared stories of how they first heard about James's quest. At one point, James slipped away from the main hub, noticing Spirit ambling just beyond the clearing. He approached the horse, who was grazing near a newly marked trail sign. "We did it," he whispered, rubbing Spirit's neck. The Mustang exhaled in a soft huff, as if in agreement. In the distance, the band's music floated through the pines. James felt an overwhelming sense of peace, the kind he hadn't experienced since before Harold's sudden death. This wasn't merely a party or a dedication. It was a collective vow to protect something precious. Mid-afternoon found James escorting small groups along a short loop trail that highlighted some of the preserve's most scenic overlooks. He explained basic ranger tips, how to identify animal tracks, the importance of leaving no trace, and the ways the ecosystem thrived when left undisturbed. Little kids peppered him with questions about the different bird calls they heard. Teenagers snapped pictures of mossy logs and sunlit clearings, promising to share them online. Even older folks seemed delighted to walk the gentle terrain, some reminiscing about their own childhood encounters with the woods. During one of these mini-tours, James felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Beatrice cane in hand, flanked by Evelyn. They had ventured a short distance onto the trail, wanting to see the vantage point that overlooked a small ravine. Though Beatrice moved slowly, her eyes were bright. "You okay to handle the slope?" James asked, offering an arm. She nodded. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." So the group moved at a measured pace, each step cautious. When they reached the overlook, an unspoken awe fell over them. Sunbeams slanted through tall pines, lighting the ravine's lush floor. A shallow stream sparkled among rocks. The distant silhouette of more forested hills rose like silent guardians. Beatrice gazed in wonder. "It's like stepping into a painting," she whispered, tears glistening. "Your father must have roamed these woods, dreaming of a day it might be claimed rightfully." James placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "He never got to finalize it, but it's happening now thanks to you. All those letters, your unwavering support, it guided me." Evelyn stood to the side, capturing the moment in a photo, but the tenderness in her gaze suggested she was as moved as her mother. A few other visitors arrived, letting out soft exclamations of delight at the view. For a while, they simply stood in reverent silence, absorbing nature's quiet majesty. Then Beatrice sighed contentedly. "Let's head back. I can't push my luck too far." James nodded, and with Evelyn's help, he guided Beatrice back to the main area where the festivities continued. When evening approached, the crowd began to thin. Families packed their cars, volunteers stacked chairs, and the folk band wrapped up their final set. The preserve looked like a cheerful campsite that had just hosted a family reunion. Lanterns were strung around the visitor station, casting a warm glow in the deepening twilight. Beatrice had retired to a cozy seat on the station's porch, dozing intermittently while Evelyn fussed over her. James ensured the cleanup ran smoothly, thanking each person until only a handful remained. A hush settled on the clearing as the last car rumbled away. Crickets sang their nocturnal chorus. James leaned against a wooden railing, scanning the open space illuminated by lanterns. The brand new sign reading, "Turner Legacy Preserve," gleamed softly. It felt surreal, a living testament to hope triumphing over distance-time and all the small tragedies of miscommunication. In the weeks following the Forest Renewal Day event, word spread of the preserve's success. Small articles appeared in local papers recounting how a forgotten property was reclaimed through a horse's unlikely delivery of lost letters. A reporter visited from a nearby city, interviewing James and snapping pictures of the newly built visitor station, the scenic overlooks, and Spirit's regal stance. While the coverage was modest, it sparked a trickle of interest from out-of-town nature enthusiasts. As the preserve settled into a routine, James finalized arrangements for public hours, volunteer-led tours, and ongoing maintenance. Ironwood Wildlife Preservation pledged to coordinate with him on specialized workshops such as wilderness first aid and birdwatching seminars. It was a dream come true, albeit one requiring constant vigilance. But James had never been afraid of hard work, particularly not when it felt so deeply meaningful. During one of his regular check-ins, Calvin Hicks from Redwood County stopped by. He wanted to see firsthand how the land was being utilized, ensuring that the partial tax forgiveness was justified. Walking the trails with James, Calvin appeared impressed. "You know," he said, "when you first showed up with those tattered letters, I doubted we'd see this day." James merely smiled, remembering his own initial skepticism. "I owe a lot of that to the community and to Spirit." Calvin chuckled. "That horse is a legend. Everyone keeps asking if it's a sign from some old folklore." James shrugged good-naturedly. "Spirit is definitely special, but I think he just found his way home." Indeed, the Mustang showed no inclination to wander off these days. Instead, he roamed the preserve's perimeter like a guardian, sometimes letting kids ride him at a slow walk, when James or an experienced handler supervised. Apart from the administrative side, James found time for personal reflection. He often visited a quiet grove of pines near the property's western border, where a small wooden bench faced a trickling stream. On the bench sat a simple plaque that read, "For Harold Turner, gone too soon, always remembered." James would sit there at dusk, the sun's last rays illuminating ripples in the water, thinking about the father he lost too early. He'd reminisce about Harold teaching him how to mend fences on their tiny farm, or gently instructing him in riding when James was just a boy. Each memory felt like a stepping stone across the dark waters of grief. Sometimes, as James reflected, he glimpsed Spirit standing at a distance, watching. The horse's gaze never felt intrusive. Instead, it seemed comforting, as if the Mustang was silently acknowledging the shared history. A story that started with heartbreak had led to a renewed sense of purpose. That was the ultimate message of the preserve. Out of loss can emerge something profoundly beautiful, if given the chance. Evelyn visited frequently, each time reporting on additional opportunities for grants or partnerships. Beatrice came less often as her health declined, yet she always insisted that James keep her updated through calls or letters. Despite her frailty, she radiated satisfaction each time James described a new development, like the day a group of local school children visited for a field trip, wide-eyed with wonder at the forest's diversity. As autumn deepened, the preserve's landscape grew even more picturesque. Mottled sunlight danced on fallen leaves, painting the trails in shades of amber and gold. James organized a small harvest-themed event in collaboration with Creek Bend's Diner and local farms, hoping to raise funds for further improvements. On the morning of the event, a gentle breeze swept through the trees, carrying the scent of cinnamon and baked apples from the stalls set up near the visitor station. By midday, families were wandering the trails, sipping hot cider and admiring scarecrows crafted by local artisans. The place teemed with laughter, a testament to how fully the community had embraced the preserve. James joined a circle of volunteers preparing a simple wooden platform for a round of folk dances. Nearby, Spirit nibbled clover in a small meadow, calmly observing the festivities. Around mid-afternoon, a ripple of alarm passed through the crowd. Several people noticed smoke rising in the distance. James's ranger instincts kicked in immediately. He dashed to the vantage point and spotted what looked like the start of a brush fire far along the forest's edge, near a remote section of the preserve. A swirl of black smoke rose ominously against the amber sky. Swiftly, James radioed the local firefighting unit and urged the volunteers to help. The music stopped and people began coordinating, some clearing the area near the station in case the fire spread, others gathering buckets and hoses. Adrenaline pulsed through James as he sprinted toward the smoke heart, pounding with the fear of losing everything they'd painstakingly built. Upon reaching the outskirts of the blaze, James found a small group of local volunteer firefighters trying to contain the flames. Dry leaf litter and brush provided ample fuel. The wind threatened to push the fire toward the preserve's core. James joined the men and women in battling the flames, using shovels to throw dirt on the fire's perimeter, while the firefighters sprayed foam and water where possible. Time blurred into frantic waves of effort, James's clothes soaked in sweat, his lungs filled with the acrid stench of burning vegetation. Then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard a loud snort. Turning, he saw Spirit standing not far off, stamping the ground anxiously. James yelled for the horse to stay back, not wanting him spooked or injured, but Spirit held his ground as though refusing to abandon James to the flames. Gradually, the combined efforts began to pay off. The fire was contained to a few acres, and its forward progression halted. The firefighters worked meticulously to douse every ember. Exhausted, James sank to his knees when it was over. Ash filled the air, and a swath of forest lay blackened, but the preserve's heart was spared. Later, investigators concluded an unattended campfire outside the preserve's boundary likely ignited the blaze. Relief and frustration mingled, relief that it hadn't spread frustration, that careless behavior threatened the land so many people had come to cherish. By the time James stumbled back to the visitor station, the sun was nearly setting. Most of the festival attendees had left, rattled by the sudden emergency. A handful stayed to ensure no one was injured. Spirit trailed behind James as if personally escorting him. No reins needed. Although drained, James felt a renewed sense of unity with the land. They had faced a threat together and prevailed. News of the brush fire spread quickly, ironically drawing more attention to the preserve and reminding people of the forest's vulnerability. Over the next few days, messages of support rolled in. Some individuals mailed checks to help pay for firefighting expenses, while others donated equipment or offered volunteer hours to clear the charred area and replant saplings. James realized that adversity, far from diminishing their resolve, had ignited an even stronger protective instinct in the community. Beatrice, upon hearing about the fire, was profoundly shaken. She called James, her voice quivering. "I'm so thankful you're safe. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you out there." Not after all this, James assured her. The damage was limited, but her concern lingered. Her health took a dip, soon after leading to another short hospital stay. Evelyn kept James informed, explaining that her mother's heart condition had worsened. James felt a pang of guilt, wondering if the stress of the fire had contributed. He contemplated naming a small grove after Beatrice, hoping it might uplift her spirits. During one of her final lucid moments at the hospital, Beatrice asked James to visit. She appeared frail, her face drawn, but she insisted on clasping James's hand. "Don't let anything destroy what you've built," she said softly. "Your father would be so proud. Promise me you'll keep it going, no matter what." James's throat tightened. He pressed her hand gently. "I promise," he said, voice husky with emotion. Shortly thereafter, Beatrice slipped into a deep sleep, then passed peacefully with Evelyn at her side. The news reverberated through the preserve's tight-knit circle of friends. They held a small memorial under the pines where Evelyn scattered some of her mother's favorite wildflower seeds along a trail. As tears mingled with the gentle breeze, James reflected on how one life's devotion could ripple through many others. It was Beatrice's letters, after all, that had set this entire story in motion. Evelyn took some time away after her mother's passing, but she later returned to the preserve, determined to honor Beatrice's memory. Together with James, she planned a living tribute garden near the visitor station, an area filled with native plants and a stone bench bearing Beatrice's name. The day they unveiled the garden, a small group of mourners gathered. Spirit wandered by as if to pay respects. Evelyn wept quietly, but thanked James for making her mother's final wish a reality. "She lived just long enough to see your father's dream made real," Evelyn said, wiping her tears. That was everything to her. In the subsequent weeks, the preserve continued to evolve, a testament to resilience and renewal. James found solace in physical tasks like rebuilding a fire break or guiding visitors along newly cleared paths. Each new person who stepped onto the trails, whether local or from afar, sensed the preserve's deeper meaning. It was more than a patch of protected forest. It was a monument to love's sacrifice and the strange, unbreakable bonds that form when people refuse to let the past die. Unacknowledged time meandered forward, bringing with it the changing seasons. By the following spring, the preserve was in full bloom, with fresh greenery, wildflowers, and the chirping chorus of returning birds. The visitor station had grown into a modest but well-equipped center, with displays about Ironwood Forest's flora and fauna, interactive maps, and a corner dedicated to the Turner family's legacy. School field trips became a common sight, with groups of excited children learning about ecosystems and conservation from James and his volunteer rangers. Through continuous effort, James whittled down the back taxes, thanks to the partial waiver and steady income from small donations and grants. He also set up a sustainable model, collecting modest entrance fees from out-of-town visitors, offering guided tours, and running a tiny gift shop that sold hand-carved souvenirs made by local artisans. In a stroke of poetic justice, he even partnered with the local post office to design commemorative postcards celebrating Spirit's delivery. The story of the Mustang, who brought the fateful letters, Spirit himself, had become an iconic presence. People traveled just to see him, to hear the story firsthand. Some wrote articles or blog posts weaving a narrative that felt almost mythic. A horse once believed lost, returning to carry messages that reshaped an entire community. For James, though, Spirit was simply family, a companion who symbolized Harold's quiet dedication. Often after the day's visitors left, James would wander the meadows with Spirit, letting the horse graze while he surveyed the preserve's boundary lines. Any sense of loneliness that once haunted him had dissolved into the hush of the forest. Evelyn remained a close ally, helping refine legal structures to ensure the preserve stayed protected even beyond James's lifetime. "Think of it as a living trust," she explained one afternoon, "so no future developer can swoop in and change everything when you're gone." James agreed wholeheartedly, wanting the land to remain an evergreen testament to those who believed in second chances, his father, Beatrice Evelyn, and the entire community that rallied around him. On a warm evening in late spring, James hosted a volunteer appreciation dinner at the visitor station's open-air pavilion. Long wooden tables brimmed with casseroles, fresh bread, and pitchers of lemonade. Strings of lights twinkled overhead, reflecting the stars. Folks who had once been strangers now felt like extended family, bound by the shared mission to protect this precious forest. Glen toasts were raised to Harold, to Beatrice, and to every unsung hero whose quiet acts of kindness shaped the world. As the evening wore on, James noticed a hush falling. People turned to see Spirit standing on a small hill just beyond the pavilion, silhouetted against the moonlight. Someone began to clap, and soon a gentle applause rose. Whether they applauded the horse, the preserve, or the memory of those who made it possible, James couldn't quite tell. But tears pricked at his eyes, the moment feeling transcendent in its simplicity. In that luminescent hush, the boundaries between past and present blurred. All that mattered was the shared acknowledgement of a journey completed and a future still unfolding. Late that night, after the volunteer dinner ended and the lanterns were extinguished, James found himself alone on the porch of the visitor station. The crowd had dispersed. Only the soft hush of the forest remained, punctuated by an owl's distant call. Spirit dozed near a patch of wildflowers, occasionally flicking his ears at nocturnal insects. In the station's dim interior light, a photograph of Harold Turner caught James's eye. Father and son standing in front of an old barn, both smiling. James stepped inside, lifted the frame, and studied it closely. He remembered that day he must have been 15 when Harold had praised him for learning to saddle a horse properly. It struck him then how many things Harold never got to witness. James's deployment, his return, his struggles to reintegrate into civilian life, and this grand reclamation of a lost inheritance. But James felt no bitterness. Instead, he felt gratitude that in some way he had shared this triumph with his father's memory. A wave of peace washed over him. He whispered, "We did it, Dad. We brought it home." Setting the photo back, James stepped out onto the porch again. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating the clearing where the small orchard he'd started was taking root. He'd planted apple saplings, just a few, hoping that in time they would bear fruit for visitors to enjoy. It was a nod to the future, a living promise that the preserve would continue to give. The thought of children biting into those apples someday, forging happy memories under these same trees, filled James with quiet joy. Breathing in the scent of pine and fresh earth, he walked toward Spirit, placing a gentle hand on the Mustang's flank. The horse stirred, blinked, and then stood calmly as though expecting James to say something important. "Thank you," James murmured. It wasn't just thanks for delivering the letters, but for being a symbol of hope, for staying, for reminding James that what's lost can sometimes be found again. A rustling in the undergrowth made him look up. A fox darted across the moonlit grass, pausing briefly to assess the human and horse, before slipping into deeper shadows. The nocturnal rhythm of the preserve continued unabated life, thriving even in the hush of midnight. For James, that moment crystallized everything he had come to believe, that the land once forgotten was now alive in the hearts of many, forging connections that might endure beyond his lifetime. He walked back toward the visitor station, each step slow and measured. The subtle glow of solar-powered lamps guided his way. He could almost sense Harold's presence beside him, the way a father might walk a child home after a day of adventure. In the sky above, stars glimmered, indifferent, yet somehow comforting in their timelessness. On the horizon, Ironwood Forest stood guard its tall pines, whispering secrets of endurance and renewal. There would still be hurdles, financial, logistical, and personal. But James felt ready. He had faced storms, fires, bureaucratic tangles, and the heartbreak of losing a father without closure. Yet he'd found healing in the act of reuniting Harold's dream with the place that should have always been his. As he gently closed the station's door, James Turner realized that for the first time in years, he felt wholly at peace. Outside, Spirit tossed his head, letting out one last soft neigh that echoed through the stillness like a benediction. Indeed, the past was no longer a burden. It was a guiding star shining its light on the path James would follow and guard for the rest of his days. In the golden glow of a setting sun, with the Mustang standing guard as silent sentinel, James Turner knows he's reclaimed far more than just land. He's recovered his purpose and reconnected with his community. This place, reborn from forgotten history and built by the strong hands of neighbors united, now stands as a powerful symbol of second chances and timeless American grit. From this journey, James learns that sometimes heroes are not forged only in battles overseas, but also in quiet moments of sacrifice, camaraderie, and unwavering loyalty right at home. We hope you felt inspired by this remarkable story of courage, redemption, and the bonds that hold us together through life's storms. Now we want to hear from you. What part of this powerful tale resonated most with your own experiences? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this cinematic journey, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell, because your support keeps these unforgettable stories alive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.